right, so your inspection's done. So now what? I'm going to kind of talk about this from both a buyer's perspective and a seller's perspective, because there's kind of little nuances that you need to know depending on which side you're at. So the first thing is, ideal situation for a buyer is that you are there during the inspection, if not for the entire inspection, at least for the tail end. And if you can't be there, then have somebody go for you, or at least have your realtor be there for you, just to get an in-person explanation. That helps tremendously, because sometimes when you have this massive 60-page report in front of you listing every little thing wrong with the property, it's a little daunting and you're not really sure what's important and what's not important. But when you're there at the property while the inspector's going through this, or at least at the very end, they can go through all their pictures and kind of go through the report with you. They can tell you, based on their experience, okay, this is pretty important, or this maybe it's an issue, something you want to fix, but it's not it's not going to bring the house down. So that is, it's really important to do your best to try and be there, or have somebody there, or at least have your realtor go at the tail end of that inspection, just to get that firsthand account from the inspector. But typically you've got this massive report. Usually it's emailed to you. All of the pages, it's going to go into a lot of detail, but there is going to be a summary in there. Different inspectors do them in different places. Usually it's one of the first few pages. It's within the first few pages is a summary of the inspection, and that's just kind of a line item page or two, and it lists kind of everything. And you're going to want to go through those things, and really, as a buyer, the things you're going to want to ask to have the seller repair. First, let me back up and say that the seller has no obligation to fix anything. You can ask as a buyer, and the seller could say no. This is another point, it's another point of negotiation within the escrow process. So, and this is why the entire contract is often, we have that contingency. It's based on the inspection and the report and how both sides are going to deal with what the inspection report says. So, as a buyer, typically you're going to want to ask for things that are going to affect the value and the functionality of the house. If it's a cosmetic thing, most sellers aren't really going to bother with cosmetic stuff. And as a seller, that's the same thing too, is it's realistic for a seller to fix things that are going to affect the functionality and the value of the house. It's not expected, even though you've been living there, for you to know everything that's going on within the walls and with under the sinks and everything. So when this inspection report comes out and it lists issues, it's realistic for a seller to fix certain things, and it's realistic for a buyer to ask that those things be fixed. It's really just a matter of having both sides be realistic, and fair, and what's right. Sides can get greedy, things can get ugly. I've been very fortunate enough that I haven't really dealt with too many of those situations. I really try and keep both sides, whichever side I'm representing, grounded, and let's put ourselves in the other person's shoes, but at the same time, you want to look out for your own best interest. So, what else? So it's the value of the functionality of the house. The other thing too to think about is that depending on what kind of financing the buyer is using, there may be things that the seller has to fix. If you're using VA financing, for example, or FHA, there are certain code things that will have to be addressed by the seller, especially before appraisal. So, for example, with a VA or an FHA, the most common things, and they usually come up in the inspection, and you want to fix them before the appraisal. The appraiser goes out there, is straps on the water heater and self-closing fire-rated door going into the garage. Those are kind of the two most typical things, just code-wise. There's, it could be tons of other things, but those are the two major things. Oh, and also fire detectors, smoke detectors, being where they need to be throughout the house. The way to kind of combat this and to come to an agreement, there's two different alternatives. Well, there's three different things that can happen. The seller can ask, or the buyer can ask the seller, okay, I want you to fix X, Y, and Z. Then the seller has an opportunity to say, okay, yes, I will fix all these things, or you know what, I'm going to fix these things and not these other things. Or they can say, I'm not going to fix anything at all, and at that point, both sides figure out whether they want to continue with the transaction or just go their separate ways. There's also asking for a credit. If it's something that's not going to, that a lender is not going to require be fixed, the seller can say, you know what, and this oftentimes happens with sellers who are out of state or out of town, where they're not going to be there in person to deal with it. A lot of times they'll say, you know what, here's a credit at closing for X amount, and this should cover the cost of the repair. At that point, that credit comes off of the down payment or the closing costs usually, and it's just less money that the buyer has to bring. The third option is making an adjustment in the overall sales price, which brings all the fees and everything down. So many different variables go into it, but that's kind of a general overview of what to do after the inspection.